On the night Yusuf ibn Ayyub entered the world, his family fled to Tikrit in disgrace. The year was 1137 AD, and along the banks of the Tigris River, a fortress commander named Najm ad-Din Ayyub faced ruin. His crime was not treason or cowardice, but mercy. He had helped a wounded warlord escape across the river when duty demanded he turn the man away. That warlord was Imad ad-Din Zengi, the most powerful Turkic commander in the Islamic world, and the soldiers pursuing him would not forgive those who had granted him passage. Before dawn broke over Tikrit's mud brick walls, the Ayyub family gathered what they could carry and vanished into the night, a newborn child wrapped against his mother's chest. The infant would grow to become Saladin, the sultan who united the Muslim world and reclaimed Jerusalem from the Crusaders. But on that first night of his life, he was merely the youngest burden carried by a family of Kurdish soldiers whose fortunes had collapsed in a single act of dangerous compassion. Zengi never forgot those who helped him. When Najm ad-Din arrived in Mosul seeking service, the warlord welcomed him and his brother Shirkuh into his inner circle. Zengi was building something unprecedented, a unified Muslim front against the Crusaders who had captured Jerusalem nearly 4 decades earlier and held it still, their 4 Christian states stretching along the Mediterranean coast like a dagger pointed at the heart of Islam. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad had fragmented into warring factions. The Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt was rotting from within. Only Zengi seemed capable of rallying the fractured Islamic world, and he did so through methods as brutal as they were effective. Young Saladin grew up in this household of war. His father administered fortresses, his uncle Shirkuh, short, stout, with appetites for food and battle in equal measure, won victories that expanded Zengi's domain. The boy learned to ride before he could properly read, but his father ensured he did both. Najm ad-Din understood that advancement required more than swordsmanship, so while other military sons trained exclusively for combat, Saladin memorized the Quran, studied Arabic poetry, and learned Islamic jurisprudence from scholars his father cultivated. His teachers noted a contemplative quality unusual in garrison children, a tendency to watch and listen before speaking, to think before acting. The fall of Edessa in 1144 marked the first great turning point of Saladin's youth. Zengi's forces besieged the weakest Crusader state through the winter, and on Christmas Eve, his sappers collapsed a section of wall. The city fell in a night of slaughter. For the first time since the Crusaders had arrived, a major Christian territory had been reclaimed for Islam. Saladin was 7 years old. He would have witnessed the celebrations, prayers of thanksgiving echoing through Mosul's mosques, the distribution of plunder, poets composing verses that named Zengi a champion of jihad. But he also witnessed what came next. Pope Eugenius III called for a second crusade, and within 2 years, the armies of King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of Germany were marching east. The lesson was clear. Victories against the Crusaders would always bring retaliation from Europe. This war would not end quickly. Zengi never faced the new crusade. In 1146, a slave he had threatened with punishment stabbed him to death in his sleep. His empire immediately fractured between his sons, and the Ayyub family navigated the transition by attaching themselves to Nur ad-Din, who secured Aleppo and most of Syria. Nur ad-Din proved a more sophisticated master than his father. Where Zengi had ruled through terror, Nur ad-Din combined military strength with religious legitimacy. He built mosques and madrasas, sponsored scholars, and presented his wars as divine service rather than personal ambition. The Second Crusade collapsed against the walls of Damascus in 1148. its armies weakened by Turkish attacks, its siege repulsed by defenders who understood what surrender would mean. Nur ad-Din watched, waited, and planned. Najm ad-Din received the governorship of Baalbek, a prosperous city in the Lebanese mountains. And here, Saladin spent his adolescent years in relative stability. He continued his religious studies, but now added lessons in administration, watching his father balance tribal interests, manage revenues, dispense justice. These were the unglamorous skills that held territories together between battles, and Saladin absorbed them thoroughly. In 1154, when Saladin was 17, the great prize finally fell. Damascus, the city that had resisted the Second Crusade, that had played rival powers against each other for generations, opened its gates to Nur ad-Din. The Ayyub family moved with their patron into the ancient city, and its gardens, libraries, and scholars completed Saladin's education in ways garrison towns never could. Those who knew him in Damascus remembered a young man more drawn to theology than warfare, more comfortable in mosques than training yards. He played polo competently, composed serviceable poetry, and showed no particular hunger for military glory. He seemed destined for quiet administration, perhaps a governorship like his father's, perhaps a life of religious scholarship. But south of Damascus, Egypt was bleeding. The Fatimid Caliphate had descended into civil war, its child caliphs mere puppets while rival viziers slaughtered each other for control of the richest land in the Muslim world. And in Jerusalem, the Crusader king Amalric I watched this chaos with hungry eyes, calculating how Egyptian gold might fund Christian armies for generations. Nur ad-Din was calculating too. Egypt could not be allowed to fall to the Crusaders. Its wealth and grain would make the Christian states unassailable. Someone would have to intervene. Shirkuh was already volunteering, and where Shirkuh went, he would soon insist on bringing his quiet, scholarly nephew. The boy born in flight was about to be thrust into the struggle that would define his life. Egypt, in the 1160s, was a corpse that had not yet stopped breathing. The Fatimid Caliphate had ruled from Cairo for 2 centuries, its Shia dynasty once commanding an empire that stretched from Tunisia to Syria. But generations of weak caliphs, palace coups, and administrative decay had reduced the Fatimids to figureheads. Real power belonged to whoever held the position of vizier, and that office had become a death sentence. Viziers rose through murder and fell the same way, their reigns measured in months rather than years. The current struggle pitted 2 men against each other: Shawar, who had been deposed and wanted his office back, and Durgam, who had seized it and meant to keep it. Shawar made the decision that would ultimately destroy his dynasty. Unable to defeat Durgam alone, he travelled north to Damascus and prostrated himself before Nur ad-Din, begging for military intervention. He promised tribute, alliance, and 1/3 of Egypt's grain revenues in exchange for an army that would restore him to power. Nur ad-Din listened carefully. He had no love for the Shia Fatimids, but he could not allow Egypt, with its wealth, its grain, its strategic position, to fall into chaos that the Crusaders might exploit. He summoned Shirkuh. The campaign of 1164 marked Saladin's first experience of war beyond garrison walls. He was 26 years old, serving on his uncle's staff more as a family obligation than from any burning martial ambition. Shirkuh had requested his presence, perhaps seeing potential that others missed, perhaps simply wanting a relative he could trust among the ambitious officers jockeying for position. Saladin rode south with the army, through lands he had only heard described in merchants' tales. The Sinai's barren expanses, the sudden green miracle of the Nile Delta, the ancient cities that made Damascus seem young. The expedition succeeded almost too easily. Shirkuh's forces swept into Egypt, defeated Durgam's army, and restored Shawar to the Vizierate. But Shawar had not survived decades of Egyptian politics by honoring inconvenient promises. Once secure in power, he looked at the Syrian army occupying his territory and saw not allies, but a new threat. He sent secret messages to Jerusalem, offering King Amalric I the same terms he had offered Nur ad-Din, tribute and alliance in exchange for military support, against his own rescuers. Amalric needed no persuading. He had watched the Egyptian intervention with alarm, understanding that if Nur ad-Din absorbed Egypt's resources, the Crusader states would face a united Muslim front they could not withstand. A Crusader army marched south, and suddenly Shirkuh found himself trapped in a hostile country, caught between Shawar's treachery and Amalric's swords. The Syrians withdrew, but Nur ad-Din had seen Egypt's vulnerability clearly now. The Fatimids could not defend themselves. Sooner or later, either Damascus or Jerusalem would control the Nile. There could be no third option. 3 years later, in 1167, Shirkuh returned with a larger army and clearer intentions. This time there would be no restoring Shawar. This time Egypt itself was the prize. Saladin rode with him again, still reluctant, still more scholar than soldier. He had spent the intervening years in Damascus studying with religious teachers, and some accounts suggest he had to be pressured into joining the expedition. War held no romance for him, but family obligation and Nur ad-Din's expectations left little room for refusal. The second campaign transformed him. Amalric responded to the new invasion by leading his own army into Egypt, and the two forces maneuvered through the delta in a deadly chess game. Shirkuh, recognizing that he could not defeat the combined Crusader Egyptian forces in open battle, made a decision that stunned everyone. He divided his army and sent a detachment to seize Alexandria, Egypt's greatest port, while he drew the enemy away with the main force. He gave command of Alexandria to Saladin. It was either a gesture of tremendous faith or a cynical sacrifice. Alexandria could not hold indefinitely against the forces Amalric would eventually bring against it, and whoever commanded its defense might well die there. Saladin found himself suddenly responsible for a city of hundreds of thousands, its walls encompassing more humanity than he had ever governed, its survival depending entirely on his decisions. The siege lasted 3 months. Amalric's forces surrounded the city, while Shirkuh raided through Upper Egypt, trying to draw the Crusaders away. Inside Alexandria, Saladin faced challenges that no amount of religious study had prepared him for: rationing, dwindling food supplies, maintaining discipline among frightened soldiers, preventing the civilian population from opening the gates to end their suffering. He walked the walls daily, visible to defenders and besiegers alike, projecting calm he did not feel. The Alexandrians began to love him. Where they expected a foreign commander to treat them as conquered subjects, Saladin governed with a restraint that seemed almost naive. He shared the hardships of the siege rather than hoarding supplies for his soldiers. He administered justice fairly between his Syrian troops and the local population. He prayed publicly and frequently, presenting himself as a servant of faith rather than a warlord seeking plunder. When negotiations finally ended the standoff, both sides exhausted, neither able to claim clear victory, Saladin emerged with something more valuable than territorial gains. He had discovered what he was capable of. The scholar who had reluctantly joined his uncle's adventure had proven he could command men, endure pressure, and inspire loyalty under the worst conditions. The people of Alexandria wept when the Syrian garrison withdrew. The final expedition came in 1169, and this time there would be no negotiated withdrawal. Amalric had overplayed his hand. In 1168, frustrated by Shawar's endless double-dealing, the Crusader king invaded Egypt on his own initiative, storming the city of Bilbais and massacring its inhabitants. The slaughter accomplished what years of diplomacy had failed to achieve. It convinced the Egyptian court that the Crusaders were the greater threat. Shawar himself sent desperate messages to Damascus, begging Nur ad-Din to save Egypt from Christian conquest. Shirkuh's army marched south for the third time in January 1169. Saladin commanded the advance guard, no longer a reluctant participant, but a tested officer whose abilities had been proven at Alexandria. The Crusaders, their forces depleted by the previous year's campaign, withdrew before the Syrian advance. Within weeks, Shirkuh's forces controlled Cairo. Shawar had betrayed too many masters to survive this final reversal. On January 18th, Saladin led the detachment that arrested the vizier outside Cairo's gates. Shawar was executed within hours. Some sources say Saladin struck the first blow personally, repayment for years of treachery that had cost Syrian lives. 2 days later, the Fatimid Caliph, a sickly teenager named Al-Adid, appointed Shirkuh as the new vizier of Egypt. The appointment stunned no one. Shirkuh had conquered Egypt. Shirkuh would rule it. Nur ad-Din's loyal general would govern the wealthiest territory in the Muslim world, sending tribute north while keeping the Crusaders at bay. The arrangement seemed stable, even elegant. Then, 65 days later, Shirkuh died. The cause was likely his legendary appetite. Contemporaries blamed a surfeit of rich food, overwhelming a constitution already stressed by years of campaigning. Whatever killed him, his death created a crisis that no one had anticipated. The Syrian army in Egypt suddenly lacked a commander. The Fatimid court, which had accepted Shirkuh's authority because they had no choice, now faced the question of who would replace him. Several candidates emerged immediately. Senior emirs who had served Nur ad-Din for decades believed their experience entitled them to command. Ambitious officers saw opportunity in the chaos. The Fatimid courtiers, hoping to reassert some independence, favored candidates they thought they could control. No one considered Saladin a serious contender. He was 31 years old, relatively junior in the military hierarchy, and had commanded nothing larger than a city garrison. His reputation rested on a single siege, impressive certainly, but hardly qualification for ruling Egypt. The chroniclers suggest that this very weakness made him attractive to the Fatimid Caliph. Al-Adid, hoping for a vizier he could manipulate, selected the scholarly nephew over the dangerous veterans. It was a miscalculation that would end his dynasty. On March 26, 1169, Saladin ibn Ayyub became vizier of Egypt, commander of its armies, administrator of its revenues, guardian of its caliph. He had entered the country as a reluctant soldier following his uncle's ambitions. He would leave it decades later as the most powerful man in the Islamic world. But first, he had to survive. He was a Sunni commander ruling a Shia state, a Syrian general surrounded by Egyptian rivals, a junior officer whose promotion had insulted every senior emir in the army. The Fatimid court expected to control him. Nur ad-Din expected absolute loyalty. The Crusaders expected weakness they could exploit. Saladin looked at the situation with the calculating patience he had learned watching his father navigate impossible politics, and he began to plan. The first challenge came within months, and it came from within. The Fatimid army had long relied on regiments of Sudanese slave soldiers, black Africans who had served the caliphate for generations and owed nothing to the Syrian interlopers now commanding them. In August 1169, these troops revolted, 50,000 men rising against an occupying force that numbered perhaps 12,000. They saw a moment of vulnerability, a young, untested vizier, a Syrian army far from home, a population that might welcome liberation from foreign rule. Saladin responded with a brutality that shocked those who knew only his scholarly reputation. He crushed the rebellion systematically, burning the quarters where the Sudanese troops had barricaded themselves, hunting survivors through Cairo's streets, executing prisoners who might have been pardoned under a more merciful commander. When the killings stopped, the Fatimid military had been broken as an independent force. The message was clear. Saladin would share power with no one. He softened the blow with what followed. Where other conquerors might have looted Egypt's wealth and shipped it north, Saladin invested in the country he now ruled. He reformed tax collection to reduce corruption, ensuring that revenues reached the treasury rather than disappearing into officials' pockets. He paid his soldiers regularly, a novelty in an era when armies often supported themselves through plunder. He built hospitals, sponsored scholars, and administered justice with a consistency that Egyptians had not experienced in generations. Cairo began to transform under his governance. He ordered construction of a massive citadel on the Makatam Hills overlooking the city, a fortress that would take decades to complete, but would eventually become the seat of Egyptian power for centuries. He expanded the city walls to encompass both the old Fatimid capital and the neighboring city of Fustat, creating a unified metropolis. He tore down Fatimid palaces, not from spite, but practicality, using their materials to build fortifications against the Crusader threat that never stopped pressing from the north. The religious question required more delicate handling. Egypt had been Shia for 2 centuries, its mosques preaching doctrines that Sunni Muslims considered heretical, its caliph claiming a legitimacy that rivaled Baghdad's. Saladin was a committed Sunni serving a Shia master, and everyone understood this contradiction could not last forever. But moving too quickly risked rebellion from a population still loyal to the Fatimid dynasty. He proceeded with surgical patience. He founded Sunni madrasas to train a new generation of scholars and judges. He appointed Sunni officials to positions that controlled religious education. He waited for the old Fatimid institutions to wither rather than tearing them down by force. The Shia population found their faith tolerated but no longer sponsored, their scholars respected but no longer powerful, their traditions preserved but no longer dominant. The final transition came in September 1171, and it came quietly. The Fatimid Caliph Al-Adad lay dying, a young man whose sickness had progressed beyond any physician's help. Saladin gave the order. The Friday sermon would henceforth be pronounced in the name of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, not the Fatimid Caliph in Cairo. It was a single sentence changed in a weekly prayer, but it ended 2 centuries of Fatimid rule. Some sources say Al-Adid died without ever learning that his dynasty had been erased. Others say the news killed him faster than his illness. Either way, Egypt was now officially Sunni, and Saladin ruled it as the representative of Baghdad's authority. The transition that might have triggered civil war passed with barely a ripple. Saladin had prepared the ground so thoroughly that the old order simply dissolved. But success in Egypt created new problems with Damascus. Nur ad-Din had sent Shirkuh to Egypt expecting a loyal subordinate who would funnel Egyptian wealth northward to fund wars against the Crusaders. Instead, he watched Saladin build an independent power base, marry into Egyptian nobility, and make decisions without consulting his nominal master. Letters from Damascus grew increasingly sharp. Nur ad-Din demanded that Saladin join campaigns against the Crusaders. Saladin found reasons to delay. The Egyptian situation remained unstable. The army needed reorganization, the harvest required supervision. The excuses wore thin. By 1174, Nur ad-Din was preparing to march south and remind his vassal where ultimate authority resided. The Islamic world held its breath, watching to see if the two most powerful Muslim rulers would go to war with each other while the Crusaders still held Jerusalem. Saladin's position was impossible. He could not defeat Nur ad-Din in open battle. Damascus commanded resources and veteran troops that Egypt could not match. But submission meant returning to subordinate status, watching his achievements absorbed into another man's empire, perhaps even facing execution for the independence he had shown. He was trapped between loyalty and survival, and neither option offered a clear path forward. Death resolved what diplomacy could not. On May 15th, 1174, Nur ad-Din died in Damascus, felled by illness at the age of 56. He left behind an 11-year-old son, al-Salih Ismail, and an empire that immediately began fracturing as rival commanders competed for control. The man who had spent his life unifying Syria against the Crusaders could not unify his own succession. Saladin received the news in Cairo and understood immediately what it meant. The master who had constrained him was gone. The heir who replaced him was a child. The emirs who had looked down on Saladin as a junior officer were now tearing each other apart in Damascus. For the first time since he had reluctantly joined his uncle's Egyptian adventure, no one stood above him. He also understood the danger. If he moved too aggressively, he would be seen as a usurper, a traitor who betrayed his master's heir for personal ambition. The religious scholars whose support he had cultivated would denounce him. The Crusaders would exploit Muslim disunity. Everything he had built could collapse if he miscalculated the next steps. But if he waited too long, someone else would consolidate power in Syria, and he would face a rival as dangerous as Nur ad-Din had been. The window for action was narrow and closing. Saladin had spent 5 years learning to rule Egypt. Now he would have to learn something harder. How to build an empire while appearing to serve one. His family would prove essential. His father, Najm ad-Din, had died in 1173, but his brother, Al-Adil, called Saladin by the Crusaders, possessed diplomatic talents that complemented Saladin's military and administrative abilities. Other brothers and nephews held commands throughout Egypt, creating a network of blood loyalty that no emir could match. The Kurdish clan that had fled to Crete in disgrace was about to become a dynasty. In October 1174, Saladin rode north with a small army, leaving Egypt in his brother's capable hands. He claimed to be defending young al-Salih against the rivals threatening his inheritance. He presented himself as a loyal servant restoring order, not a conqueror seizing territory. The fiction convinced few, but it provided enough cover for those who wanted to submit without appearing to betray their former master's son. Damascus opened its gates without a fight. The city that had shaped Saladin's youth, where he had studied and prayed and grown from boy to man, now acknowledged him as its ruler. He wept when he entered, some chroniclers report. Whether from genuine emotion or calculated performance, none could say. Perhaps both. He had returned to his true home, and nothing would ever be the same. The orphan of Tikrit had become the most powerful man in the Muslim world. But power meant responsibility, and responsibility meant confronting the enemy that had defined Muslim politics for 3 generations. Jerusalem still flew Crusader banners. and Saladin had sworn to tear them down. Unity proved harder to forge than Saladin had imagined. Damascus had welcomed him, but Aleppo, the other great city of Syria, slammed its gates and prepared for siege. The Zengid emirs who controlled northern Syria saw Saladin not as a liberator, but as a usurper, a Kurdish upstart who had stolen what rightfully belonged to Nur ad-Din's heir. They rallied around young al-Saleh, forming a coalition that stretched from Mosul to Aleppo, determined to crush the Egyptian interloper before he could consolidate his gains. The Battle of the Horns of Hama in April 1175 shattered their hopes. Saladin met the Zengid coalition army near the city of Hama, where twin hills gave the battlefield its name. His forces were outnumbered, but they fought with the cohesion of men who had campaigned together in Egypt, while the coalition army suffered from divided command and mutual suspicion. By nightfall, the Zengid forces had scattered, and Saladin stood as the undisputed master of Syria south of Aleppo. He could have pressed north immediately, but Saladin understood that military victory alone would not build lasting authority. He spent months consolidating, installing loyal governors, winning over local religious leaders, distributing wealth to those who had supported him. The chronicler Imad al-Din al-Isfahani, who would become Saladin's secretary, noted how carefully the Sultan cultivated legitimacy. He sought formal recognition from the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, receiving titles that transformed him from a warlord into an anointed defender of Sunni Islam. He married strategically, binding Syrian noble families to his cause through unions that created obligations no battlefield victory could match. Aleppo continued to resist, its walls too strong for direct assault, its defenders too stubborn to negotiate. Saladin besieged the city in 1176, but withdrew when it became clear that taking it would cost more than he could afford. He would return again and again over the following years, each time tightening the noose without quite closing it. Patience had served him in Egypt. It would serve him again here. But not all enemies could be waited out. The assassins struck without warning. This secretive sect of Nizari Ismailis had carved out a network of mountain fortresses in Syria, their power resting not on armies, but on targeted murder. Their leader, Rashid ad-Din Sinan, known to the Crusaders as the Old Man of the Mountain, had decided that Saladin's unification threatened assassin independence. In 1175, a knife-wielding attacker lunged at Saladin during a military review, barely deflected by an emir who threw himself between blade and sultan. Saladin escaped with a scratch on his cheek. The assassin died under a storm of swords. A second attempt came months later, this time inside Saladin's own camp. An assassin disguised as a soldier got close enough to strike before being cut down. The blade pierced Saladin's armor, but failed to reach flesh. He had taken to wearing chainmail beneath his robes, a precaution that saved his life. The near miss unnerved him in ways that battlefield dangers never had. Armies you could see coming. Assassins appeared from nowhere, wearing the faces of trusted men. In 1176, Saladin marched on Masyaf, the assassin stronghold perched high in the Syrian coastal mountains. His army surrounded the fortress, and for weeks it seemed he might attempt what no ruler had managed: the destruction of the assassin menace at its source. Then, according to legend, he withdrew suddenly and never troubled the assassins again. The stories varied. Some said he woke to find a poisoned dagger on his pillow with a threatening note. Others claimed Rashid ad-Din appeared in his tent like a ghost and delivered a warning no sane man could ignore. Whatever truly happened at Masyaf, Saladin and the assassins reached an understanding. They would not trouble each other again. He could afford no more distractions. The Crusaders were watching, and they had found a king worth following. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem was 16 years old when he faced Saladin for the first time, and he was already dying. Leprosy had been diagnosed when he was a child, the disease slowly destroying his body while leaving his mind sharp and his courage undimmed. He could not grip a sword with his numbing hands, so he had his arms strapped to his shield. He could not feel his horse beneath him, so he rode by balance and instinct alone. He had every reason to let others fight his battles, and instead he led from the front with a recklessness that inspired his men and terrified his enemies. November 1177 brought Saladin's greatest humiliation. He had invaded the kingdom of Jerusalem with a massive army, perhaps 26,000 men, confident that the Crusader forces were too scattered to resist. Baldwin had only a few hundred knights available. The rest of his army dispersed across the realm. By every calculation, Saladin should have swept through to Jerusalem itself. Instead, Baldwin force-marched his tiny force to intercept, gathering whatever knights and Templars he could find along the way. At Montgisard, near the coast, the leprous king caught Saladin's army spread out and unprepared. The Crusader charge shattered the Muslim center before Saladin could form proper lines. What followed was not a battle, but a rout. Saladin's army disintegrated, men fleeing in all directions while Crusader knights hunted them across the coastal plain. Saladin himself escaped on a racing camel, his bodyguard dying around him, his reputation in ruins. He lost nearly 90% of his army that day. The Sultan, who had conquered Egypt and unified Syria, rode back to Cairo with barely enough men to constitute a guard. It was, by any measure, a catastrophic defeat, the worst he would ever suffer. Lesser men might have been destroyed by Montgisard. Saladin treated it as education. He analyzed what had gone wrong: the overconfidence, the scattered formation, the failure to account for Baldwin's desperate courage. He rebuilt his army with the methodical patience he brought to all his endeavors. Within 2 years, he was campaigning again, and this time he made no mistakes born of arrogance. The castle of Jacob's Ford became his redemption. The Crusaders had begun constructing a massive fortress at a critical crossing of the Jordan River, a stronghold that would threaten Damascus itself once completed. Saladin besieged it in August 1179, his engineers working day and night to undermine walls that were still rising. The garrison fought with suicidal courage, but the castle fell before it could be finished. Its half-built towers pulled down, its strategic threat eliminated forever. Months later, at Marj Ayun, Saladin ambushed a Crusader force and captured several of the kingdom's most important nobles. The shame of Montgisard was being slowly erased. Baldwin IV fought on despite his decaying body, winning truces when he could not win battles, using diplomacy to preserve what force of arms could not. Saladin came to respect him as he respected few enemies, recognizing in the leper king a mirror of his own determination. When Baldwin proposed truces, Saladin often accepted, understanding that both sides needed time to recover from the grinding wars. There was an honor between them that transcended religious hatred. Two men who understood the burdens of leadership and the costs of endless conflict. But Baldwin was dying more visibly each year. By 1183, he could no longer ride. By 1184, he could barely see. The kingdom that depended on his will was already fracturing as nobles jockeyed to control whoever would succeed him. And among those nobles, one man seemed determined to make peace impossible. Reynald of Châtillon was everything Saladin despised: faithless, cruel, and utterly indifferent to consequences that others would have to bear. A French adventurer who had married into control of the fortress of Kerak, Reynold treated truces as opportunities rather than obligations. He raided Muslim caravans during peacetime, attacked pilgrim routes to Mecca, and once launched ships into the Red Sea to threaten the holy cities themselves. When other Crusader lords protested his provocations, he ignored them. When Baldwin IV ordered him to make restitution, he refused. Saladin besieged Kerak twice, in 1183 and 1184, trying to eliminate the man who had become a symbol of Crusader bad faith. During the first siege, a wedding celebration was underway inside the fortress, the marriage of Reynold's stepson to a princess of Jerusalem. According to legend, Saladin asked which tower housed the newlyweds and ordered his catapults to spare it. The courtesy was genuine. So was the determination to destroy Reynold himself. But Baldwin IV relieved the siege both times, the Leper King making his final contributions to his kingdom's defense. Baldwin died in March 1185, not yet 25 years old. His death removed the one Crusader leader capable of restraining Reynold and maintaining unity among the fractious Latin nobles. The succession that followed was a disaster. Baldwin's nephew, a sickly child, died within a year. The crown passed to Guy de Lusignan, a French noble who had married Baldwin's sister and whose primary qualification for kingship was that no one could agree on anyone else. Guy was weak where Baldwin had been strong, indecisive where Baldwin had been bold, and utterly unable to control Reynold or anyone else. Saladin watched the Crusader kingdom tear itself apart and knew his moment was approaching. For 12 years, he had built, unified, consolidated, and prepared. He had survived assassination and catastrophic defeat. He had assembled an empire that stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates, bound together by loyalty, marriage, and shared purpose. The Muslim world had not been this united since the first caliphs. All he needed now was a cause that would justify holy war, a provocation so outrageous that no Muslim could counsel patience. Reynold of Châtillon, as if reading Saladin's thoughts, was about to provide exactly that. In late 1186, a massive caravan wound its way through the desert south of Kerak, traveling from Cairo to Damascus along routes that treaties had declared safe. Merchants led camels laden with goods worth fortunes. Pilgrims journeyed toward Mecca for the Hajj. Among the travelers, according to some accounts, was Saladin's own sister. Reynold descended on them like a wolf on sheep. His knights scattered the guards and seized everything: the merchandise, the animals, the people themselves. When survivors protested that a truce protected them, Reynold allegedly mocked their faith, suggesting they call upon Muhammad to save them. The captives were dragged to Kerak and thrown into dungeons. The goods disappeared into Reynold's treasury. Saladin sent messengers to King Guy, demanding restitution and the release of prisoners, as treaty obligations required. Guy ordered Reynold to comply. Reynold refused. He answered to no one, he declared, and certainly not to a king he had helped place on the throne. Guy lacked the power or the will to compel him. The insult could not stand. Saladin swore before his emirs that he would kill Reynold with his own hands. He spent the spring of 1187 assembling the largest army he had ever commanded, perhaps 30,000 men, drawn from every corner of his empire. Egypt sent its disciplined regulars. Syria contributed fierce cavalry. Volunteers arrived from as far as Mesopotamia, drawn by the promise of jihad against the Crusaders. Saladin gathered them at the springs near the Sea of Galilee, a position that threatened the entire Crusader kingdom, while providing abundant water for his host. The Crusaders mobilized in response, summoning every available knight and sergeant to meet the threat. Guy de Lusignan commanded perhaps 20,000 men, the largest Christian army the kingdom had ever fielded, stripped from every castle and city until the realm stood nearly defenseless behind them. They gathered at Sephoria, 18 miles from Saladin's position, near springs that could sustain their forces indefinitely. Everything depended on what happened next. The trap that Saladin laid was elegant in its simplicity. On July the 2nd, a detachment of his forces attacked the city of Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, quickly overrunning the town and besieging the citadel, where the Countess Esquiva, wife of Raymond of Tripoli, one of Guy's most important vassals, held out with a small garrison. The message was clear: come save her or watch her fall. Raymond himself counseled patience. Tiberias was his city, his wife who faced capture, yet he urged Guy to hold position at Sephoria. The springs there provided water. The terrain favored defense. Let Saladin exhaust himself besieging a minor citadel. Let the summer heat do what Christian swords might not. Time favored the defenders. Reynald of Châtillon called Raymond a coward and a traitor. Other lords demanded action. Guy, weak and indecisive, chose the worst possible course. He ordered a march toward Tiberias across 12 miles of waterless plateau in the height of summer. The army set out on July 3rd, 1187. By midday, Saladin's skirmishers were harassing the column, swooping in to loose arrows and retreating before the Crusaders could respond. The heat was murderous, men in chainmail under the July sun, horses lathered and stumbling, water supplies dwindling with every mile. The springs of Sephoria fell behind them. The Sea of Galilee remained impossibly far ahead. As darkness fell, Guy halted his army on the plateau, near a double hill called the Horns of Hortin. There was no water. His men had marched all day, fought running skirmishes, and now faced a night of thirst with battle certain in the morning. Some commanders urged a desperate night march to reach the lake. Guy refused, perhaps too exhausted to think clearly, perhaps hoping the morning would bring better options. It brought only Saladin. Muslim forces had surrounded the Crusader camp during the night, cutting off any retreat to Sephoria and blocking the path to the lake. When dawn broke on July 4th, the Christian army found itself trapped on a waterless plateau, ringed by enemies who had spent the night resting beside abundant springs. Saladin's men set fire to the dry brush, sending smoke billowing across the Crusader positions, adding choking misery to their desperate thirst. The battle was less a fight than an execution. The Crusader infantry, crazed with thirst, broke formation and rushed toward the lake they could see glittering below, only to be cut down by Muslim cavalry. The knights charged again and again, with the courage of despair, but each attack lost momentum against enemies who simply retreated and returned. Raymond of Tripoli led one charge that somehow broke through the encirclement. Saladin's men parted to let him escape, recognizing that removing one of the few competent Crusader commanders served their purposes better than killing him. By afternoon, the remnants of the Christian army had retreated to the Horns of Hattin itself, a desperate last stand around the tent of King Guy and the kingdom's most sacred relic, the true cross itself, the very wood upon which Christ had died, carried into battle as a talisman of divine protection. The relic had accompanied Crusader armies for generations, its presence a promise that God fought beside them. Saladin's final assault swept over the hilltop like a wave. The true cross fell into Muslim hands, a catastrophe beyond military calculation, a sign that God himself had abandoned the Crusader cause. King Guy was captured, along with Reynald of Châtillon, the Grand Master of the Templars, and dozens of the kingdom's greatest lords. The army that had marched from Sephoria effectively ceased to exist. That evening, Saladin received his prisoners in his tent. Guy de Lusignan was brought before him first, trembling with fear and thirst. Saladin offered him a cup of iced water, a gesture of hospitality that by Arab custom implied the guest's safety. Guy drank and passed the cup to Reynold. Saladin's voice cut cold. "You did not have my permission to give him water." The Sultan rose and faced the man who had broken truces, raided pilgrims, and threatened Mecca itself. He offered Reynold a choice: convert to Islam and live or die. Reynold, defiant to the end, refused. Saladin drew his sword and struck him across the shoulder. Not a killing blow, but a wound that staggered the prisoner. Guards finished the execution, and Reynold of Châtillon's body was dragged from the tent. Guy de Lusignan watched in horror, certain he would be next. Saladin turned to him with words that would echo through centuries. "Kings do not kill kings. That man was killed only because of his maleficence. Guy would eventually be ransomed. The other noble prisoners would be held for negotiations that would strip the kingdom of its remaining resources. But for the Templars and Hospitallers captured at Hattin, Saladin reserved a different fate. These military orders were the backbone of Crusader defense, monk warriors who had sworn to fight Islam until death. They could not be ransomed, for they would only return to battle. They would not convert, for their vows bound them absolutely. Saladin ordered them executed, some 200 knights beheaded by Sufi volunteers, who considered the act a religious duty. It was the single greatest atrocity of Saladin's career, and he never expressed regret for it. The kingdom of Jerusalem lay open before him. In the weeks following Hattin, fortresses fell like dominoes. Acre surrendered within days, its garrison too weak to resist. Jaffa, Sidon, Beirut, Ascalon, city after city opened its gates, their defenders dead or captured at Hattin, their walls manned by old men and boys who knew resistance meant death. Saladin moved with a speed that stunned even his own commanders, accepting surrenders, installing garrisons, and pressing on before the shock of Hattin could wear off. By September, only a handful of Crusader strongholds remained. Tyre on the coast, a few scattered castles, and Jerusalem itself. The Holy City had been in Christian hands for 88 years. Its fall in 1099 had been accompanied by a massacre that killed every Muslim and Jew within the walls. Men, women, and children slaughtered until blood ran ankle-deep through the streets. Crusader chroniclers had boasted of the killing, describing it as righteous cleansing of sacred ground. The memory burned in Muslim consciousness like an unhealed wound. Now Saladin stood before Jerusalem's walls with an army flushed with victory, and everyone expected him to repay massacre with massacre. Balian of Ibelin held the city. One of the few Crusader lords who had escaped Hattin, he had come to Jerusalem only to evacuate his family, but found himself trapped by Saladin's rapid advance. The population begged him to organize the defense. There were perhaps 2 knights in the entire city. Balian knighted every noble boy over 16 and armed the burghers as best he could. It was a gesture of defiance, not a realistic defense. The siege began in late September. Saladin's engineers undermined a section of wall near the northeastern corner, and when it collapsed, everyone knew the city could not hold. Balian requested terms. The negotiation was brutal. Saladin initially refused any terms at all, reminding Balian of what the Crusaders had done in 1099. The defenders would receive what their grandfathers had given: death. Balian responded with a threat of his own. If no terms were offered, the defenders would destroy Jerusalem's holy places, kill the thousands of Muslim prisoners they held, and fight to the last man. The city Saladin wanted to liberate would be a ruin. Saladin relented. The terms he offered were harsh, but not murderous. Every Christian would be allowed to leave upon payment of ransom. 10 dinars for a man, 5 for a woman, 1 for a child. Those who could not pay would become slaves. The deadline was 40 days. On October 2nd, 1187, Saladin entered Jerusalem. There was no massacre. His soldiers, under strict orders, maintained discipline that contemporary observers found almost miraculous. Churches were left standing. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre remained open to Christian pilgrims. The great cross that the Crusaders had mounted atop the dome of the rock was torn down and dragged through the streets. But the Christian and Jewish populations were allowed to leave in peace if they could pay their ransoms. Thousands could not pay. Saladin freed many from his own treasury. His brother Al-Adil asked for 1,000 slaves as a reward for his service, then immediately released them. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, Heraclius, was allowed to leave with cartloads of treasure from the churches, wealth that could have ransomed hundreds of the poor left behind. When his own officers grumbled at such generosity, Saladin replied that he would rather be blamed for excessive mercy than excessive cruelty. The contrast with 1099 was absolute and intentional. Where the Crusaders had waded through blood, Saladin had shown restraint. Where they had killed without discrimination, he had offered terms and honored them. The propaganda value was immense, proof that Islamic civilization was more honorable than the barbarians who had stolen Jerusalem in the first place. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Templars had used as their headquarters, was cleansed and restored to Muslim worship. The dome of the rock was purified with rosewater brought from Damascus. For the first time in 88 years, the call to prayer echoed across Jerusalem. Saladin had achieved what no Muslim leader had managed since the First Crusade. He had united the Islamic world and reclaimed its third holiest city. Poets composed verses celebrating him as the new conqueror, the champion of jihad, the man who had erased the shame of 1099. But even in triumph, he made a mistake that would cost him dearly. Tyre still held. Conrad of Montferrat, an Italian nobleman who had arrived by sea just as the city was about to surrender, had rallied its defense and turned back Saladin's assault. Exhausted from months of campaigning, eager to secure Jerusalem before winter, Saladin chose to bypass Tyre rather than commit to a long siege. He would return, he told his commanders. The city could wait. It was the strategic error that would undo much of what Hatton had won. Tyre's harbour remained open to European ships. Its walls sheltered the survivors who had fled from across the kingdom. And somewhere across the Mediterranean, news of Jerusalem's fall was spreading through Christendom like wildfire, rousing kings and princes to take up the cross and march east. Saladin had awakened something far more dangerous than the kingdom he had just destroyed. The Third Crusade was coming. When news of Jerusalem's fall reached Rome, Pope Urban III collapsed and died. Whether from shock or illness, chroniclers disagreed, but the symbolism was unmistakable. His successor, Gregory VIII, issued a papal bull called Audita Tremendae that described the disaster in apocalyptic terms. Christendom had lost the holiest city on earth. God was punishing his people for their sins. Only a new crusade could redeem them. The response exceeded anything the Muslim world had anticipated. 3 kings took the cross. Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, the most powerful monarch in Europe, who had ruled the Holy Roman Empire for nearly 4 decades. Philip II of France, young and ambitious, eager to prove himself in holy war. And Richard of England, called Lionheart for a courage that bordered on recklessness, a warrior king whose reputation already echoed across the continent. Together, they commanded resources that dwarfed the armies of the First Crusade. Together, they intended to take back everything Saladin had won. Frederick marched first, leading perhaps 15,000 men overland through Byzantine territory and into Anatolia. His army was the largest, the most disciplined, and the most experienced. Veterans of decades of German wars who followed an emperor they had served since youth. Saladin received reports of their progress with growing alarm. If Frederick reached the Holy Land with his forces intact, the situation would become desperate. God, it seemed, had other plans. On June 10th, 1190, Frederick Barbarossa drowned in the Salif River in southeastern Anatolia. The circumstances remained unclear. Perhaps his horse stumbled crossing a ford. Perhaps the cold water stopped his aged heart. Perhaps he simply could not swim beneath the weight of his armor. Whatever happened, the greatest threat to Saladin's conquests died in a minor river crossing. His body recovered, but his army shattered by grief and desertion. Only a fraction of the German host continued to the Holy Land. The rest turned home. Their crusade ended before it properly began. Saladin offered prayers of thanksgiving when he heard the news. Frederick's death was a deliverance he had not dared hope for. But Richard and Philip were still coming, their armies travelling by sea where rivers could not claim them. While the kings prepared their fleets, the crusade had already begun at Tyre. Guy de Lusignan, released from captivity after swearing oaths he had no intention of keeping, had arrived at Tyre expecting to resume command. Conrad of Montferrat, who had saved the city when Guy had lost the kingdom, refused to admit him. The two men despised each other, and their rivalry would poison Crusader politics for years. Denied Tyre, Guy made a decision that seemed suicidal. With a tiny force of knights and adventurers, he marched south and laid siege to Acre. Acre was the greatest port in the kingdom, massively fortified, held by a strong Muslim garrison. Guy's army was laughably inadequate for the task, but his audacity attracted followers, survivors of Hattin, new arrivals from Europe, anyone who wanted to strike back at Saladin. The siege camp grew into a city of its own, sprawling across the plain outside Acre's walls. Saladin responded by besieging the besiegers. His forces surrounded the Crusader camp, trapping Guy between the walls of Acre and the swords of the Muslim army. For 2 years, the siege became a grinding stalemate. Assaults and sorties, disease and starvation, reinforcements arriving for both sides only to die in the trenches. The cream of European chivalry perished in the malarial swamps around Acre, their dreams of Jerusalem ending in fever and filth. Saladin himself fell ill during the siege, his body weakening under the strain of constant campaigning. He was 53 years old and had spent the last 2 decades in nearly continuous warfare. The fever that racked him in 1189 never fully departed. From this point forward, his health would be a race against time. He drove himself relentlessly, nonetheless, riding the lines, directing assaults, refusing to show weakness before men who depended on his strength. The stalemate broke in the spring of 1191. Philip II of France arrived first, his fleet carrying fresh troops and precious siege equipment. Richard followed weeks later, having conquered Cyprus along the way, a characteristic detour that combined strategic value with personal glory. The English king's arrival transformed the siege. Where Philip was cautious and political, Richard was a force of nature, personally directing assaults, exposing himself to enemy fire, driving his men forward through sheer will. Richard also brought something the Crusaders desperately needed: money. His treasury funded the construction of massive siege engines, paid mercenaries who had gone months without wages, and purchased supplies that the starving army devoured. Within weeks of his arrival, the walls of Acre were crumbling under sustained bombardment. The garrison surrendered on July 12, 1191. The terms promised their lives in exchange for the return of the true cross, the release of Christian prisoners, and a substantial ransom. Saladin agreed to the terms, needing time to gather the prisoners and treasure scattered across his empire. What followed became Richard's great crime. The deadline for Saladin's payment approached, and negotiations over the details remained unresolved. Richard, impatient to march on Jerusalem and suspicious that Saladin was stalling, decided to send a message. On August 20th, he ordered the garrison of Acre, some 2,700 Muslim prisoners, including women and children, marched out of the city in view of Saladin's army and executed. The killing took hours. Saladin's soldiers watched helplessly from the hills as their comrades were butchered. The massacre shocked even Richard's allies. It violated every convention of medieval warfare, every understanding that ransomed prisoners were sacred. Saladin had shown mercy at Jerusalem. Richard showed none at Acre. The contrast would echo through centuries of propaganda, each side claiming moral superiority based on how prisoners had been treated. Saladin retaliated by executing his Christian prisoners, but the strategic damage was done. Richard had demonstrated that he would not be delayed by negotiations or constrained by conventions. He was coming for Jerusalem, and nothing would stop him. The march south began in late August. Richard kept his army tight against the coast, where his fleet could provide supplies and support. Saladin's forces shadowed the column, looking for an opportunity to repeat the victory of Hattin, to catch the Crusaders strung out and vulnerable, to destroy them before they could threaten Jerusalem. The opportunity came at As-Suf on September 7th, 1191. Saladin threw his entire force against the Crusader column, waves of cavalry sweeping in to loose arrows and withdraw, trying to break the enemy formation and create chaos that heavier attacks could exploit. Richard's army endured the punishment with discipline that Saladin had never seen from Crusader forces. The knights absorbed charge after charge, holding formation despite the goading of Muslim riders who came close enough to strike with swords. When Richard finally ordered the counterattack, it hit with devastating force. The Crusader cavalry smashed into Saladin's center before the Muslim forces could properly withdraw, and for the first time in his career, Saladin watched his army break. The rout was not as complete as Montgizard. His forces retreated rather than disintegrating, but the defeat was undeniable. Richard had proven himself Saladin's equal on the battlefield. The Crusader army marched on, reoccupying Jaffa and establishing a base for the assault on Jerusalem. Saladin fell back toward the Holy City, preparing for a siege he was not certain he could withstand. His army had been badly shaken at As-Suf. His treasury was depleted. His emirs were exhausted and quarrelsome. If Richard pushed forward immediately, Jerusalem might fall. Richard did not push forward. The reasons remain debated by historians. Some argue that his army was too weakened for a siege, its ranks thinned by disease and the casualties of constant fighting. Others suggest that Richard understood a political reality Saladin did not. Even if he captured Jerusalem, he lacked the forces to hold it once he returned to Europe. Conquering the city would mean nothing if it fell again within months of his departure. Twice Richard advanced toward Jerusalem, in January 1192 and again in June, and twice he turned back. His army came close enough to see the city's walls, close enough that some men wept at the sight of the goal they had traveled so far to reach. Richard reportedly refused to look, declaring that he would not gaze upon a city he could not take. For Saladin, The retreats were salvation wrapped in frustration. Each time the Crusaders withdrew, he strengthened Jerusalem's defenses, demolishing the walls of cities he could not hold to deny them to the enemy, scorching the earth to starve any army that came. But each time Richard returned, the strain told more heavily on the aging sultan. His health deteriorated visibly. His commanders noted how often he had to rest, how the fevers returned with each change of season. The war settled into a pattern of raid and counter-raid, negotiation and collapse, brief truces and sudden violence. Richard stormed the castle of Durham in the south. Saladin threatened Jaffa in response. Letters passed between the two camps with surprising frequency, not just demands and threats, but something approaching dialogue between men who had learned to respect each other. The respect was genuine. Saladin never met Richard face to face, but he came to understand his enemy through the conduct of war. He admired Richard's courage, his skill at arms, his willingness to share the dangers he asked of his men. When Richard's horse was killed under him at one battle, Saladin sent him 2 fresh mounts, a gesture of chivalry that Richard accepted without irony. When Richard fell ill, Saladin sent fruits, snow for cooling, and offered the services of his own physicians. These courtesies were not merely diplomatic theatre. They reflected a genuine affinity between 2 men who understood what the other faced. Both were rulers whose power rested on military success. Both commanded armies that wanted to go home. Both faced enemies at their backs. Richard's brother, John, scheming in England. Saladin's emirs growing restless under endless war. They were trapped together in a conflict neither could win decisively. The final crisis came at Jaffa in July 1192. Saladin's forces stormed the city while Richard was negotiating at Acre, capturing most of it in a sudden assault. The citadel held out, its garrison hoping desperately for relief. Richard came by sea with a tiny force, perhaps 50 knights and a few hundred crossbowmen, and waded ashore into the midst of the Muslim army. What followed became legend. Richard fought on the beach with a ferocity that stunned witnesses on both sides. His crossbowmen held off cavalry charges while he organized a counterattack that somehow drove Saladin's forces from the city. By nightfall, Jaffa was back in Christian hands, and Saladin had suffered perhaps the most humiliating reverse of his career. Defeated by a force a fraction of his own, commanded by a king who seemed genuinely superhuman in battle. Both sides were exhausted. Richard was ill again, barely able to sit his horse. Saladin's army was melting away, emirs leading their contingents home rather than face another winter in the field. The war that had raged for 3 years had achieved nothing but stalemate. The Crusaders held the coast from Tyre to Jaffa. Saladin held Jerusalem and the interior. Neither could destroy the other. The Treaty of Ramla, signed in September 1192, recognized this reality. The Crusaders retained their coastal strip and the right to visit Jerusalem as unarmed pilgrims. Saladin kept Jerusalem itself and the lands beyond the coastal plain. The true cross was never returned. Some said it had been lost. Others that Saladin simply refused to surrender such a powerful symbol. The treaty was to last 3 years, though neither man expected to still be fighting when it expired. Richard sailed for Europe in October 1192, never to return to the Holy Land. His crusade had failed to recapture Jerusalem, but he had saved the Crusader states from extinction. A century more of Christian presence in the Levant would follow, bought by the blood spilled between Acre and Jaffa. Saladin watched the English fleet disappear over the horizon and turned toward Damascus. He had held Jerusalem. He had survived the greatest military challenge of his life. He had matched the finest warrior of the Christian world and emerged with his empire intact. But the cost had been everything he had left to give. His body was failing, his treasury was empty, and the peace he had won felt less like victory than exhaustion. He was 54 years old, and he had nothing left. Saladin returned to Damascus in November 1192, riding through the gates of the city that had shaped him more than any other. The crowds that greeted him saw a conqueror returning in triumph, the man who had taken Jerusalem, who had faced down the kings of Europe, who had held together an empire through 3 years of desperate war. They did not see how heavily he leaned on his saddle, how the fever that had plagued him at Acre still lingered in his bones, how much older he looked than when he had ridden north to face Richard's army. He was home, and he knew he was dying. The winter months passed quietly. Saladin met with his emirs, distributed rewards to those who had served faithfully, and began the slow work of repairing an empire strained to breaking by the war. His sons would need to hold what he had built: Al-Afdal in Damascus, Al-Aziz in Egypt, Al-Zahir in Aleppo, and he spent his remaining energy trying to ensure their succession would not tear his legacy apart. His brother, Al-Adil, the ablest administrator in the family, received instructions to support his nephews, though everyone understood that Al-Adil's own ambitions might not remain so restrained once Saladin was gone. He rode out one last time in February 1193 to greet a pilgrim caravan returning from Mecca. It was a small gesture, the kind of pious courtesy that had always mattered to him, but the winter rain soaked through his robes and chilled him to the bone. The fever returned that night, worse than before. His physicians could do nothing. For 2 weeks, Saladin lingered between life and death. He remained lucid enough to conduct some business, to speak with his closest companions, to ensure that the arrangements he had made would hold. His secretary, Imad al-Din al-Isfahani, and his biographer, Baha al-Din ibn Shaddad, stayed close, recording the final days of the man they had served for years. A scholar was summoned to read the Quran at his bedside, and the sound of scripture filled the room as Saladin drifted in and out of consciousness. He died on March 4th, 1193, shortly after dawn. He was 55 or 56 years old. The sources disagree on his exact birth date, and he had spent the last 24 years in nearly constant warfare. The man who had united the Muslim world from the Nile to the Euphrates, who had retaken Jerusalem and faced down the Third Crusade, passed quietly in his bed while a reader recited verses about the mercy of God. When his servants prepared his body for burial, they discovered what those closest to him had long suspected. Saladin had died with almost nothing. His personal treasury contained 47 Nasiri dirhams and a single piece of Syrian gold, not enough to pay for his funeral. The man who had controlled the wealth of Egypt and Syria, who had received tribute from a dozen cities and ransoms from 100 noble prisoners, had given it all away. To soldiers, to scholars, to the poor, to anyone who had asked. His generosity had been so relentless that his family had to borrow money to bury him. They laid him to rest in a mausoleum beside the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, the great congregational mosque that had witnessed Muslim prayers for 500 years. The tomb was modest by royal standards, a wooden cenotaph in a small chamber, nothing like the grand monuments that other sultans built to immortalize themselves. It suited a man who had valued restraint over display, substance over spectacle. The mourning that followed his death spread across the Islamic world. In Cairo, where he had begun his rise to power, crowds filled the mosques to pray for his soul. In Jerusalem, the city he had liberated. The Friday sermon praised him as a champion of the faith. Even in the Crusader territories, chroniclers recorded his death with something approaching respect. William of Tyre's continuators, no friends to Muslim rulers, acknowledged that Saladin had been a worthy adversary, cruel in war when necessity demanded, but honorable in ways that put many Christian lords to shame. The empire he had built did not survive him intact. Within years, his sons were fighting each other, and within a decade, Al-Adil had pushed them aside to rule directly. The Ayyubid dynasty that bore his family name would govern Egypt and Syria for another 60 years before falling to the Mamluks in 1250. But the unity Saladin had forged was always personal, held together by his reputation, his relationships, his ability to balance competing interests. No one who followed him possessed those qualities in the same measure. His legacy proved more durable than his empire. In the Islamic world, Saladin became the model of the righteous ruler, the sultan who fought for faith rather than personal glory, who showed mercy to the defeated, who died poor because he could not stop giving to others. Stories accumulated around his name, some true and some embellished, until the historical man became difficult to separate from the legend. He was cited as an example by rulers who wanted to claim legitimacy, and by reformers who wanted to shame corrupt governments. His recapture of Jerusalem remained a point of pride for centuries, proof that Muslim arms could triumph over Western aggression when properly led. In the Christian West, something strange happened. The enemy became a hero. Even during his lifetime, Crusader chroniclers had struggled to reconcile Saladin's military success with their expectations of Muslim barbarism. He was too chivalrous, too honorable, too recognizably noble to fit the stereotype of the infidel tyrant. After his death, this ambivalence transformed into admiration. Dante, writing his Divine Comedy a century later, placed Saladin in limbo alongside the virtuous pagans, not damned to hell, but dwelling in a castle of light with Homer, Aristotle, and Caesar. It was the highest honor a medieval Christian could offer to a non-Christian soul. The troubadours went further. They wove Saladin into romances alongside King Arthur and Charlemagne, making him a model of knightly virtue whose courtesy shamed the Christians who fought him. Walter Scott's novel, The Talisman, written in 1825, portrayed Saladin as wiser and more honorable than Richard himself, a noble adversary whose greatness elevated the conflict beyond mere religious war. The image persisted, Saladin as the chivalric ideal, the enemy who proved that honor transcended faith. Modern assessments have been more complicated. Scholars note that his mercy at Jerusalem coexisted with the massacre of Templars at Hattin, that his generosity depended on wealth extracted from conquered populations, that his unification of the Muslim world required wars that killed thousands of fellow Muslims. He was a man of his time, shaped by its values and constrained by its necessities. Neither the saint his admirers imagined, nor the tyrant his enemies feared. But perhaps the truest measure of the man lies in what he chose to do with the power he accumulated. He could have lived in splendor, hoarding the treasures of Egypt and the tribute of Syria. Instead, he gave until there was nothing left to give. He could have massacred the population of Jerusalem, repaying the atrocities of 1099 with interest. Instead, he offered terms and honored them, freeing thousands from his own pocket. He could have executed King Guy after Hattin, eliminating a rival and sending a message of terror. Instead, he showed the mercy that kings owed to kings, even enemy kings. These choices were not inevitable. Other rulers in his position chose differently, and history would have understood if Saladin had done the same, but he did not. Again and again, when power offered him the opportunity for cruelty, he chose restraint. When victory offered him the chance for vengeance, he chose mercy. Not always. The Templars at Hattin would testify to that, if any had survived, but often enough that it defined him. Often enough that enemies who had every reason to hate him found themselves respecting him instead. The frontier child who had been born in flight, whose family had been exiled for an act of mercy, had grown into a man who made mercy his defining characteristic. Perhaps that first night, when compassion cost his family everything, had taught him something about the kind of ruler he wanted to be. Perhaps the years of watching his father and uncle navigate impossible politics had shown him that fear alone could not hold an empire together. Perhaps his religious studies had convinced him that God's judgment mattered more than any earthly calculation. Or perhaps he was simply the man he chose to be, making decisions that reflected values he had cultivated across a lifetime of thought and action. Damascus still holds his tomb. The wooden cenotaph has been supplemented over the centuries. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany donated a marble sarcophagus during a visit in 1898, but Saladin's remains lie in the original modest structure, a few steps from the great mosque where his name is still honored in Friday prayers. Visitors come from across the world. Muslims who revere him as a champion of their faith. Westerners who learned his name from history books and novels. Curious travelers who want to see where the man who retook Jerusalem finally rests. The inscription above his tomb calls him Al-Malik al-Nasir, the victorious king. But those who knew him best remembered something else. Baha al-Din, who had served him for years and watched him die, wrote that Saladin's greatness lay not in the battles he won, but in the character he maintained while winning them. He had held power without letting it corrupt him. He had waged war without letting it harden him. He had defeated his enemies without letting hatred consume him. In an age of iron, he had remained human. The call to prayer still echoes from the minarets of Damascus, as it has for more than 800 years since Saladin died in the city he loved. The Crusader kingdoms he fought against are dust and memory, their castles ruins, their bloodlines scattered across Europe. The empire he built has fractured and reformed a dozen times, conquered by Mongols and Ottomans and Europeans, redrawn by treaties and wars and revolutions. But the story of the man who was born in exile and died in poverty, who united a fractured world and reclaimed a holy city, who faced the greatest warriors of his age and emerged with his honor intact, that story endures. It endures because it speaks to something beyond the politics of the 12th century, or the religious conflicts that defined his era. It endures because Saladin showed that power and principle need not be enemies, that strength and mercy can coexist in the same soul, that a man can fight without losing himself. He was born Yusuf ibn Ayyub, son of a disgraced officer fleeing into the night. He died Salah ad-Din, the righteousness of the faith, the sultan who made his enemies admire him. And somewhere between that first night and his last breath, he became something that neither his family nor his enemies, nor perhaps even he himself had ever expected. He became Saladin,